Live from Utrecht, this is Bitcoin
Explained.
Hey Sjors.
Hello.
So Sjors, today we're going to talk about partially signed Bitcoin transactions.
That's right.
AKA PSBTs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our dear avid listener, as you certainly know, we've already discussed this in probably at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 episodes previously. But every time that it came up, it was sort of in context of some other topic, like the actual topic we were discussing. And we didn't really make any episode specifically about partially signed Bitcoin transactions. So Sjors and I decided we should have an episode that's really about partially signed Bitcoin transactions.
That's right.
I'm just sort of prefacing that because if you've heard us explain it in previous transactions, you know, we won't blame you if you want to skip this episode. We'll still be your friend. Isn't that right, Sjors?
No, I think you should just listen to it.
Sjors and I don't always see eye to eye. Let's just get to our favorite part of the episode.
That's right.
Sjors stacks sets, Sjors stacks sets, Sjors stacks sets.
Yeah, this is why he really wanted to have video, because it's quite funny. But I'll read 2. One is from Eric99, who says, "Stay humble, stack sats." And for 50,000 Satoshis. And another one that's funny, I think, from Advake, 10,000 Satoshis with "This podcast has encrypted my heart."
Oh, that's so sweet.
And that's a reference to the last episode.
To the peer-to-peer encryption episode. Sjors, if people want their boostergrams read out loud in Bitcoin Explained and pay you the sweet sats, what do they need to do? Where do they go?
Oh, they need to Google something like value for value or boostergrams and install one of these modern podcasting 2.0 apps that allow you to stream sats per minute, and also, if you like, do a shout out.
Okay.
There's no guarantee that I'll read it.
So that was Sjors stacked sats. Back to the episode. Sjors, partially signed Bitcoin transactions. First of all, is this one of the parts of Bitcoin that you've contributed to, like, actively? Is that right? Or
I've definitely done testing of it, a little bit of review, but
because you've done a lot of work on like hardware wallet integration, and I think that probably has something to do
that
with
definitely
this.
uses PSBTs a lot. So I've definitely seen a lot of them, but I don't write this particular code.
Okay, so let's, as always, start at the beginning. What before there were partially signed Bitcoin transactions, before this existed? Or usually we start with the one sentence explanation of what it is. So can you give us a 1 sentence explanation of what PSBTs are?
Yeah, it's basically a file that contains a draft transaction or even a complete transaction and some extra information about the transaction. So the partially signed stands for that it might not be signed at all, or it might have 1 signature if it's a multi-sig out of 5, etc. So it's a place where you collect all the components for a transaction.
Okay. So that's the 1 sentence explanation. Now let's go to the beginning. So before this existed, what was the problem? Why did someone think that this needed to exist?
Well, the problem is when you're trying to do anything other than just creating a simple transaction where, you know, you have a wallet, you're sending coins somewhere, and your wallet just makes a transaction, signs it, and it's done. If you want to do something more complicated, like signing offline, or if you want to use a hardware wallet, maybe especially one that's somewhere else, or if you wanted to do a multi-sig transaction, well, we talked about multi-sig in earlier episodes, then things became more complicated. You'd have to somehow ferry that transaction around and make sure that all the other devices know what they need to do. And there was only ad hoc solutions to that.
Hang on. Okay, so the key thing here is that sometimes, like, a Bitcoin transaction consists of, you know, data.
Yeah, consists of inputs, yes, signatures, outputs.
Well, that's the point, though. So sometimes you want to create a signature on a different device than you created the rest of the transaction with, right?
Yes.
And this was already possible even before PSBTs.
Yes, it was.
Like Electrum already allowed this, and I think even Bitcoin Core allowed this kind of stuff. But they did it in different ways. Right?
Yeah, and it was a fairly ad hoc. Yeah, basically it was ad hoc. Yeah, and it was not very flexible. So, for example, Bitcoin would create a transaction that would I think it would just set all the signatures to 0, and then your other wallet software would just have to guess what it has to do.
You said Bitcoin. I think you mean Bitcoin Core then?
Yes.
Right. Okay, but that would still work if you use Bitcoin Core, right? So it's only a problem, I would guess, if you want to create a transaction on Bitcoin Core and then sign it with Electrum or something like that. Or if you want to create a multi-sig and one person's using Bitcoin Core, someone else is using Electrum, someone else is using whatever wallet they're using. Yeah, that's when it becomes a problem. Is that right?
I think it also becomes a problem if you want to use a wallet that's offline and not caught up to the most recent blockchain. So because if you're not up to date to the latest blockchain, you don't necessarily know how to sign something, because the transaction itself, when you receive it, it has inputs, and those inputs refer to previous outputs. And you don't have those previous outputs unless your blockchain is up to date. So if you have some deep cold storage and you don't want to sync it to the blockchain, this is also quite annoying.
Okay, so that's and we did discuss this in a previous episode. I don't remember what episode, but this also so there's several issues where it could be an issue that there wasn't a unified protocol for figuring out this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that's the core of the problem, right? Originally.
So there's another thing that is difficult to do. So it really depends on how your wallet is set up. If you have your copy of Bitcoin Core somewhere else in an offline place, but that has the same wallet as you do, then the following problem is not a problem. But one of the things you want to do is you want to check that your change address is actually real. So if we're doing a transaction together, for example, we might have a shared wallet of, 10 Bitcoin, and we want to send 1 Bitcoin somewhere. Then I'll show you a transaction. Hey, just sign this part, and it'll show 1 Bitcoin and 9 Bitcoin. And then the problem is that you don't know that the original amount is 10 Bitcoin. Like I might tell you that is the case, but in order for you to check that, you need to know a few other things about the wallet.
You know what? I think this is the very first episode we ever made. Is where we discussed this, what you're mentioning right now.
Yeah, exactly.
So
in the first episode, we described some attacks related to change addresses. So I guess there's two different things. I wasn't super clear there. One is that you want to know that the change address that's listed in a transaction is actually yours. So Bitcoin Core can easily check that. It sees an address. It just checks out its 3,000 addresses that it has in memory and says, okay, this is one of mine. So anything that goes there is really change. The other is that you want to make sure that the total amount that you're spending, so in this case, 1 Bitcoin goes somewhere, 9 Bitcoin is change, that is actually the total amount that you're spending. So I could trick you and spend a 20 Bitcoin coin and have 1 Bitcoin going somewhere, 9 Bitcoin being change, and then 10 Bitcoin going to some miner that I'm collaborating with. And in order to prevent that, you need to have the previous output. So basically, there's a bunch of information that you want to know for your own safety.
All right, I've now heard a lot of things, and I want to move on to the next part of this podcast, but also I want to make sure that this part was clear. So, to reiterate, even before PSBTs, you could sort of create transactions and sign them somewhere else. It was already possible, but there were a number of problems with that. One is you're using different wallets to create the transaction and to sign it. That was a problem. Another one is multi-sig, where different wallets want to sign it in a different way. And then the third is there are a couple of attacks. Is that the best way to sort of bucket that one? There's a couple of attacks, and it has to do with change addresses. It has to do with previous transactions and you not knowing how much money was involved. So overpaying fees.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. How about we just cut it there? So we got...
Yeah, that sounds like a good summary.
The third bucket is all kinds of attacks.
Yeah.
Simple. All right. So at some point, someone thought we need to improve this. Who was this when?
Well, many people probably thought it, but Andrew Chow actually wrote the standard called PSBT in 2017, I think.
Okay, he started in 2017, and it's done now? This is a complete...
Yeah, it's been done for many years.
I guess you can always upgrade it or update it. Does that happen, or is it kind of just done?
No, there is a version 2 for PSBT, which came out a few years ago, but it's only a very small change. So generally with PSBT, it's pretty flexible, so we can explain how it works.
Yeah, how does it work, Sjors? What is PSBT like concretely? What does it do?
Yeah, it's a bit boring. It's just a file, and the file contains the information you need for a transaction. You could say the ingredients for a transaction. So it contains the inputs that you're trying to spend. It creates the outputs that you want to send to. It contains signatures, and rather normally in a Bitcoin transaction the signatures are right inside the input, but here you would neatly separate all this stuff. So
they're in the witness, right?
Yeah, or depends on if it's SegWit or not.
Okay, does PSBT do both? Does it do non-SegWit? Okay.
Yeah, but the signatures are basically in a separate place, or the witnesses are in a separate place. The same with Taproot. I think it has its own place for these things. But you can also put more in it. For example, you can put an XPub in it, and this XPub can help the other wallet figure out which addresses it owns. You can put BIP32 derivation paths in it, so you can see, okay, if I have my wallet seed, what derivations do I do to actually get this change address, for example, so that you can check that it's your own address. There can be Taproot-specific things, so if you have multiple different possible scripts, you can provide the script in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's how I would imagine this, and just correct me if this is too simple. So it sounds like you're basically creating a file which has fields which are dedicated for put the inputs in this field, put the outputs in this field, put the signatures in this field, and so forth.
That's right.
And you don't have to fill them all. You can just fill some of them and leave others open, and that's what you would send to whether it's your multi-sig partner or your hardware wallet. And then your multi-sig partner would know, oh, this is a PSBT, so this is how I look at this. This is what these fields mean. These are filled out. These are empty. Now I know what to do with it.
Exactly.
This is basically what it is.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you can add to it is a previous transaction. Right. So in the scenario where you don't know in the scenario where you don't know how much money you're spending, the trick is to basically put in the previous transaction, because the previous transaction will say on the output side what the amount is. And therefore the signer can check that.
And the signer would check that by checking the blockchain, essentially.
It would simply check that this transaction that it's spending, that this has the output. It doesn't necessarily care that this transaction really existed. Depends on what you're trying to verify. But in this case, the idea is that you can't make a fake transaction. I mean, you could make a fake transaction, but if the fake transaction doesn't exist on the blockchain, then you're signing something that is spending a transaction that does not exist on the blockchain.
And therefore is invalid. Yeah.
So it won't get broadcast. So in that sense, you should be fine there.
Right.
But it is annoying to have to include the previous transaction, and we talked in earlier episodes that SegWit reduced the need to include this previous transaction, but there was a bug in SegWit, and so you still kind of have to include the previous transaction. And with Taproot, hopefully you don't have to include the previous transaction, because you actually know what the amount is without having to check the previous transaction. So that's nice.
Okay. So just to sort of contextualize this, the PSBT, it's not a consensus rule. It's not even part of the Bitcoin consensus or Bitcoin protocol at all.
No.
I guess depending what you want to call part of the Bitcoin protocol, but it's really a convention that essentially wallet developers can use, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, it makes the wallets more interoperable and makes it easier to do these more complicated signings.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So what wallets use this right now?
Well,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's actually increasing. So I think the first wallet that actually ever supported it is the Cold Card. And the way the Cold Card works is, it has different ways of working, but one way it works is completely separate from your computer, air-gapped, as people would call it. You use Bitcoin Core on your computer to create a transaction that has no signatures on it. Then you put that on an SD card. You put the SD card in the device signs it, spits out the SD card, and you put the SD card back in the computer, and then Bitcoin Core reads it, sees the signatures, and sends it. And so this is that's kind of why it fits that model very well. But recently, I believe Ledger also added it, and so actual support for it. And one of the things that I think they needed PSB2 for this, because PSB2 made some things easier to handle for the device. The problem with these hardware wallets is that they tend to have very limited resources, so they cannot, especially in case of the Ledger, they can't hold the whole transaction in memory. So if the transaction is very big, especially if it has previous transactions that you also want to look at, it cannot hold all of it in memory. And so I think they set up a whole ritual where the computer would send the first part of the PSBT, and then the wallet would check it and would ask the computer for the next part of the PSBT or some other part, etc., and then go through it. One of the other things hardware wallets can do with this is, again, because they don't have so much memory, a hardware wallet typically doesn't know which addresses it controls. So if you're saying, here's a change address, if you're doing that on a laptop, you can just check your list of 3,000 addresses and see that it's a change address. But for a hardware wallet, keeping such a long list is not practical. So instead, the PSBT says, hey, this is how you derive your own change address. And then the hardware wallet will actually do the derivation and say, yep, if you do this from a seed, I get this address, and now I know that it's actually a change address. So that's kind of what the devices do with it. Others that use the device, I don't know if any other hardware wallets, how far they are along, but there is a project called HWI, which we have covered in an earlier episode 30, I believe.
Yeah, maybe give a quick recap of what it is.
Yeah, it's called
maybe
hardware wallet
do that anyways.
Integration. And what it does is it basically is a bridge between Bitcoin Core and a whole bunch of different hardware wallets. And that way, Bitcoin Core only needs to speak PSBT as a language. It can send a PSBT to a device. It can receive a PSBT from the device. But if the device itself doesn't speak PSBT, HWI can do the translation for it. So then it's HWI, it's actually taking the PSBT and turning it into whatever obscure format the device wants.
Yo, what is going on, guys? We are proud to have Voltage as a sponsor of this episode. How many of you developers out there have wanted a streamlined infrastructure provider for your particular project? Well, I'll tell you what, Voltage is the Bitcoin infrastructure provider you have been looking for that makes building on Bitcoin quick and easy, whether it's Bitcoin nodes, Lightning nodes, BTC Pay, and so much more. But don't take it from me. Just ask the guys over at Amboss, Sphinx, Podcast Index, and Thunder Games, and so many others that you guys already know and love. Their enterprise-grade products make it fast and easy to build, deploy, and scale your next project. So make it easy on yourself. Even normie plebs can use the dashboard or API. Don't wait before the next block confirmation. Let your team focus on building great products and let Voltage handle all the rest. Voltage is your go-to zero management Bitcoin infrastructure solution.
Okay. Is there a reason not to just speak PSBT other than I haven't had the time to implement it yet? Are there any downsides to it?
Well, I think that's the biggest argument. So wallets haven't had times to implement it. My guess is that any wallet that wants to do something fancy and new, like say Miniscript, would be wise to just use PSBT, because even just having to figure out yourself how to do these complicated things, it's probably easier to just use something that's out there.
All right. So, but if you use a hardware wallet with Bitcoin Core, and the hardware wallet speaks PSBT, then you don't need HWI.
Well, you kind of still do, because other than the format, there's other things you need to do to communicate to a hardware wallet. You need to speak USB, for example. And all the USB stuff, that's also something that we don't want to put in Bitcoin Core because it creates a bunch of dependencies. So the HWI will still, know where to find the hardware wallet physically, like which port it's on, and then talk over USB or some other protocol. But it will not have to do any translation. So...
Are you fluent in USB, Sjors?
I am not. And also the example of the ledger I just gave you, where the ledger cannot hold the whole PSBT in all of it in its memory, then what PSBT does is basically helping with the back and forth. So it's able to send part of a PSBT that the hardware wallet asks for. Bitcoin Core doesn't know how to do that. So there's still a role for PSBT for HWI or something similar. Which I think brings us to the last user that we wanted to briefly talk about.
Yeah, so there's also... So recently we've seen, for example, Bitcoin Magazine has been publishing these inscriptions and these ordinals, which we love because we're contractually obligated to love it. Aren't we, Sjors?
I don't think I'm contractually obligated to love it. I didn't even know they had them until like 5 minutes ago.
Oh, you didn't know? Yeah, Bitcoin Magazine has been publishing some inscriptions and some ordinals, and it is controversial. Like, people are now not coming to the conference in Miami. I mean, I don't think a lot of people, but it's like a Twitter controversy.
Okay.
For the record, ordinals are still retarded. I agree with that. As yours as well, I think.
But are they a cancelable offense? That's the question.
Right. Yeah, that is the question. I would say probably not.
Anyway, we talked about inscriptions especially, not so much ordinals in general, in an earlier episode. So we don't have to repeat that.
Yeah. But there is something interesting. So there's something interesting about the way that Bitcoin Magazine did the sale. And I don't think it's unique to Bitcoin Magazine, but there is something interesting there. And it is using PSBTs. So it's called a Dutch auction.
Mm-hmm.
What is a Dutch auction, Sjors? And why is it called a Dutch auction?
Well, because the Dutch invented it.
I mean, is this how the tulips are still traded?
So usually when English people say Dutch something, it's an insult. Dutch courage is like if you drink a lot of alcohol and then you have courage. But a Dutch auction is actually not an insult. It's actually just the mechanics of an auction. The idea is you, as the seller, you start at a high price and you say, does anybody want to buy it at this price? And then you go down in price and you go down in price until finally somebody matches your order.
I mean, I think that's still how it works, right? If you go to like the big auction houses for the tulips and stuff like that. I've never been, but I've seen it on television. I think that's actually how they do it.
I think so. Then they would have been doing it for about 400 years now. So
right.
It's a long tradition. So you can use PSBTs for this, and apparently that's what Bitcoin Magazine did. They did a Dutch auction using PSBTs.
Yeah, so how does that work?
Yeah,
what's the idea here, and how do PSBTs come in?
Yeah, so PSBTs even come in without an auction, because there's also websites where you can just buy, I think you can buy inscriptions or something like that, and they also use PSBTs. So we should explain that mechanism first. The idea is that basically you create a PSBT, so a draft transaction essentially, that has on the input side, it takes your inscription, ordinal, whatever, and then on the output side, it's sending a certain amount of money to you. But that's not the complete transaction. But that's the only part you care about. What you want is to receive a bunch of money, so that's what you're specifying on the output. And what you're willing to do for that is to send the inscription /ordinal / whatever it is anywhere. You don't care where it goes. You just care that you get the money. Now, you publish this PSBT on a website or on an exchange, whatever it is. Somebody else can come in and say, hey, I think this is a fair price. Let me take this PSBT and add an input, namely my money, and add one or two outputs. Maybe you add an output for change and an output for where you want the ordinal inscription, whatever it is, to go.
Yeah.
And then you sign that. And you put it yourself on the blockchain. So it's kind of a non-interactive thing where as a seller, I can just make this PSBT, sign my part of it, send it somewhere off to a website and forget about it. And one day I wake up and there's money in my wallet and the ordinal inscription, whatever it is gone.
Yeah, so we mentioned the empty fields of a PSBT. And so you publish a PSBT with some of these fields empty. Actually, probably most of the fields are empty, right? Really the only field that's not empty is one of the outputs and the amount there. Like you just want...
So the workflow...
And I guess one of the inputs, which has to be the ordinal.
Yeah, the workflow is a little bit different than you might be used to, because for a multisig, the transaction, if you're doing a multisig, the transaction is generally complete, but it's missing signatures. And in this case, the transaction is incomplete in the sense that it even misses inputs and outputs. So because the thing I just published as a seller is not going to be accepted on the blockchain, because it is a transaction that is spending more than it's sending, because what it's sending is just some Satoshi. So it's only spending one Satoshi, and it tries to have an output of, 100 Bitcoin or whatever I asked for my amazing NFT. So somebody will have to provide that input. Yeah, and that's the buyer has to add their own inputs. So then how do you make that into a Dutch auction? Well, the idea is very simple. I, as the seller, create this transaction which has sent me 1 Bitcoin. And then after some time, I create another transaction that says, okay, whatever, send me 0.99 Bitcoin. And then a while later, I make one that says send me 0.98 Bitcoin, and until somebody actually publishes something on the blockchain. So I keep an eye on the mempool probably, and as soon as I see this money coming towards me, I will stop making new PSBTs.
Yes.
Unless, of course, it's double spent and I just try again.
Yep, I think that's also how Bitcoin Magazine did it. So they published a new PSBT, I think maybe every block, or otherwise maybe it was every hour, or I don't remember exactly. But yeah, so the price for each new PSBT went down, and if someone wants to pick it up,
Yeah, so in theory, you could publish a whole bunch of PSBTs in one go and use time locks, but this will create problems. But what you could do is say, well, you can commit inside the PSBT, or you can say, okay, this can only be spent after this height, this can only be spent after that height. And that means whoever wants the NFT or whatever it is from you will have to, take that transaction and make sure that it's confirmed before the next round. Because otherwise some other person might take the lower price, sign that, and pay a higher fee.
Wait, what you're saying is, there are several things you could be saying, and I'm not sure which one it is.
Okay.
But that's also because I wasn't paying attention, because I was thinking about the next step in the podcast.
All right.
So what you were saying is, if there's several people during the same block that both want to buy it, then it becomes a bidding war of fees, right?
Well, I
Is
guess
that what you were saying?
we didn't cover that yet. That's
Okay,
actually interesting. No, I was covering the scenario where you create multiple PSBTs
at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time, you put them all on the website, and you just say the first one can only be spent after this height. The second one can
with
be
time
spent
locks.
after,
That's what you were saying.
Exactly.
Right. See, I wasn't paying attention at all at
No,
this
clearly
at
not.
this moment. Okay, you were talking about the time lock solution, and the problem with that was
The problem with that is that as a buyer, let's say I'm okay with the highest price, I sign it, but I put a very low fee on it. Now, after a block or two, or whatever the next interval is, some other person takes the second highest price and puts a higher fee on it, and they might be able to get into a block earlier than me. So even though they paid a lower price, they still win the auction.
yeah. Well, yeah. So that's why you can only publish one PSBT at a time. You really can't
It
publish
just
them all at
depends
once.
on how much chaos you're willing to accept. But as a seller, of course, you have an incentive to get the highest price for it. So it's not a good idea as a seller to publish a lower offer.
It's just a bad idea for the reason you just explained.
Yes.
Like you, yeah. I mean,
No, I mean, the
if
chaos
you-
is something
if
you may
if
not-
That's the goal in itself. Yeah.
You may not care
Professor
about chaos,
Chaos,
right?
yeah, sure.
You may be ambivalent to it, but it's not to your advantage to get a lower price. It's great for the miners,
Sure.
but it's not good for you.
Okay, and then the problem I mentioned, which is a real issue, is that different people can say yes to the same price, but because a Bitcoin block is only mined once per 10 minutes, as opposed to an actual tulip auction, which really the first person to press the button will get it, a Bitcoin block is only mined every 10 minutes, so now you can get a fee war before a block is actually mined where people bid against each other. Does
Yeah.
PSBT, I guess it doesn't even matter anymore now that Bitcoin Core has completely liberated, replaced by fee. Or first seen is actually what they liberated, right?
I mean, I think part of the PSBT is you can probably specify whether or not it's
Well, that was gonna be my
RBF flag is on. I haven't looked at that.
that was gonna be my question. Yeah. However, now that Bitcoin Core has the full replaced by fee option, it doesn't even matter anymore, does it, Sjors?
Well, I don't know if it mattered at all in the beginning, so we did a whole episode about that. I'd rather not rehash it.
I mean, I was just trying to get a reaction, which I didn't get.
Go listen to the episode we did about RBF.
All right, so that was that. So I think we've explained PSBTs. We explained where it came from. We explained how it's being used now in Dutch auctions. And I think, so one of the links you mentioned is Open Ordax. So I guess that's where it just happens all the time, or that's where people can buy ordinals.
Yeah, but that's not an auction. I think that's just one
a
price.
marketplace. Okay, yeah. For those who are wondering, by the way, so the Bitcoin Magazine inscriptions and ordinals, that was like the original Bitcoin Magazine covers were uploaded as an inscription on the blockchain, and then the ordinals give you the ownership rights of the covers. Just kidding. That's obviously not true. That's not how ownership rights work, as we also discussed in the previous episode. So you're buying just a Satoshi, but you can then pretend to own the cover. So that's that part. I think we're kind of done then, right? Is there anything else we need to discuss in this episode?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to bring up is, so the PSBT format is pretty flexible. And one of the things that I don't think I put in the show notes, but the idea is that when a new standard comes along, like Taproot or something else, you can add fields to it. And so old wallets will not understand those fields. They probably just don't know how to sign the Taproot transaction, and it'll be fine. And the other thing you can do, so this is like a soft fork, so everybody wants those new fields. So you'd probably make a BIP and say, hey, these new fields now belong to PSBT. But if you run your own company and you have some process internally where the accountant needs to sign something, nobody outside of you cares about the accountant's signature. But there's actual fields in PSBTs that you can use for that, called proprietary fields. So you can, within your organization, extend the PSBT format basically to include extra stuff that you need for yourself and you don't bother anyone else with.
Right. Okay. Sjors, this was clear to me. I learned a lot, like
Great.
always.
Sounds good. In that case, thank you for listening to Bitcoin
Explained.